I want to thank you all so much for joining us and for your continued support and participation in the Maverick Diversity Institute. We're grateful to have you. We're grateful to have the fantastic panelists that we have with us today. And our moderator for our discussion on microaggressions and intersectionality is Professor Dani Scott, who is the Assistant Professor in Speech, Hearing, and Rehabilitation Services. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dani, and to introduce the rest of our panel.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I think it would be nice if everyone went around and introduced themselves. Is that okay? Reauna, you can start.
Sounds good. Thank you. My name is Reauna Stiff. I am the student body president here at Mankato. I'm in my office right now, CSU 280. So if you ever want to come by and see me, I'm always here. I'm really excited to be on this panel today. And so thank you everyone for the invite.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rolan. I am the Interim Director for the Violence Response and Awareness Program. I am happy to be here today on this panel, and I hope we talk about great things.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pakou, and I serve as the Director of Asian American and Multicultural Affairs within our Multicultural Center. Good to be here with you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Idman, and I am an intern from the LGBTQ Center, and I'm happy to be here. So.
Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves and for being here and being open to participate. Microaggressions are not really the easiest thing to talk about. I think it can bring up a lot of emotions. So I just really appreciate you having the courage and bravery to share your stories in hopes that we can move forward and do better. I think we don't just share stories for sympathy or just to talk, but it is to educate so that we can all move forward in a positive direction. Before we start with individual questions or questions to the panel, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about what microaggressions are. I think that now it seems like the word is getting a little more popular, but I don't want anyone to be confused as to what they are. I think just listening to the term micro, that part of the word makes you feel like this is something that's not really serious, but in fact it is. So I do want to explain a really dictionary definition of what microaggressions are, followed by the different types of microaggressions. So microaggressions are the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. So the first part of that definition, brief, commonplace, daily, that's really where the micro comes from. It comes from the fact that these things can be subtle, so subtle that the person that the violence is against, because this actually is a form of symbolic violence. So there's nothing micro about it, but the micro part really signifies that this is something that happens often, so often that the people who experience it sometimes question to the point where, should I even be mad about this? Did this even happen? So that's where the micro part comes from. But this is in fact a symbolic violence, and it is an example of racism, which is systemic. And then there are three different types of microaggressions. And so when the panel is kind of sharing their stories, I want you to maybe try to compartmentalize, like, what type of microaggression are they speaking of? So the first being micro insults, and that's racialized, gendered, or sexualized demeaning comments and behaviors. Okay, and that's really the most common. Micro assaults is old-fashioned racism. So a lot of times people like to put racism in a box, and if someone is walking around with the noose or using the N-word, oh my gosh, that's so extreme. That's really blatant racism. But racism is on a continuum. So micro assaults is really the most old-fashioned form of racism or sexism, heterosexism, carried out by individuals, and it is deliberate. And then the other type of microaggression, which I think is one of the most hurtful, is micro invalidations. And that is the negation of feelings, perceptions, and people who experience racist, sexist, gendered microaggressions and microassaults. And so that is hurtful because you feel like you have this experience and other people fail to acknowledge that you have that experience. And that's what micro invalidations are. I want to also reiterate that microaggressions do not just have to do with race. So it is race, it is gender, it is sexuality, it is religion. All of these things fall under the category of microaggressions, and this is a form of symbolic violence towards another person. So with that little tidbit, little explanation, I hope you guys have an understanding of what microaggressions are before we actually share some experiences. So we can just kind of move with the flow. I'm an informal professor. If you've ever taken a class with me, I do not like things to be dry and stiff. So I'm going to pose these questions to the panel and just unmute yourself. And when you feel comfortable, please share an experience. So the first question is, share your experience with microaggressions.
Oh, well, I living in Mankato for a number of years. I have learned that I have experienced microaggressions from day to day, but I also have learned to give people grace, because actually talking to the people here in Mankato, which I didn't grow up, I grew up in a very diverse place, which is Minneapolis, Minnesota, and coming to Mankato was like a shock for me as well. So I used to experience really, really subtle microaggressions, and but in talking to people, I've learned that you don't know what you don't know. So people walk around and they actually, they learn these things over time, and they don't know that it's a bad thing until you actually point it out, like, hold up, wait, like that's nothing to say to me, you know? So that's my experience with microaggressions.
So Shadow, you would say that being maybe in a place like Mankato, when there isn't as much ethnic or racial diversity, that perhaps a lot of the microaggressions you've experienced were not deliberate, they were from a place of ignorance?
Yes, and I give that the opportunity and time to actually make it a teachable moment for the person who literally does not know, like they didn't know. So yes.
Yes, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I can follow up from Shadow's comments. I too am not from Mankato. I'm not even a Minnesota native. So I'm actually from Illinois. And when people think of Illinois, they immediately think of Chicago, which is super diverse, but I am not from Chicago either. I am from a place in Illinois that is kind of similar to Mankato and similar to the towns that surround Mankato, in that it's very small and some rural community as well. And so Mankato was actually an upgrade for me. And then I got here and quickly realized that it was more rural and more similar to where I was from than I originally thought when I had toured. And so I would say my experience with microaggressions is that they can manifest in different ways. And so Professor Dani kind of mentioned the different categories of microaggressions, and I can just talk about some of the ways that like I've experienced them. And so microaggressions, I think for many people, again, as Shadow mentioned, they don't think of them as that, or they don't think of what they're saying is something derogatory or something hurtful. But I think microaggressions can manifest themselves as like pointed questions for people that you're looking for a certain answer, or they can manifest themselves as assumptions about a person. And so you're going into a conversation looking for one viewpoint and looking for one experience from people. It can manifest itself as nitpicking with people. For example, I know many people of color at jobs and different professional settings experience microaggressions just from being themselves. And so I guess my experience with microaggressions so far has been just the manifestation of different types of violence and different types of hurt in different settings as well.
Thank you for sharing. Alex in the chat talked about the culture shock of moving from perhaps a more diverse place, such as the Twin Cities, to Mankato. And Reauna, you spoke a lot too about really just the subtle nature of microaggressions, and that they are very commonplace. They're happening in the workplace, they're happening on school campuses, at restaurants. I mean, anywhere you could think of, these types of things can occur. And it can be very, even though small, I think added together, the sum of experiencing that can definitely take a toll on someone.
Yeah, and I could definitely speak to both of that. Also coming from the Twin Cities and coming to Mankato for my undergrad, I remember going to Walmart and people just, especially children, you'll notice it in children. They look at you and they're like, oh, you don't look like folks that I see around here. And I would say in the past couple of years, it has gotten a little bit more diverse, but we do know that much of the diversity is from our students coming to Mankato, to MSU. I would say a repeat of this cycle happened to me at the beginning of the pandemic. Just going to the grocery store, and this is before the mask mandates, and being an Asian person wearing masks at the store when no one else was wearing masks. It's the thing about microaggressions, like we deal with it so much that we start to think about this. Like I have to be aware of how people may perceive me and if I'm in danger. So it's definitely been interesting to see it happen in cycles, and we see how these work within our communities and what our people face.
Absolutely. I think you're speaking also to just the burden that the second guessing and always wondering how you are perceived by others. I think that everyone, no matter, where your background, you are going to have some sort of, I wonder what people will think about me. But as a person of color, or maybe as a person of a certain religious group, you have an even more of a burden, because the reason why you are second guessing has to do with who you are, which is something that you cannot change. And I didn't mention this before, but even in thinking about microaggressions, we have to acknowledge that there's a thing called intersectionality, where we all have multiple identities. So you even want to think about what identities that you have and the privilege associated with each of those identities, because then the microaggressions you experience can be more complex if you have more identities associated with privilege. So if you are a Black woman, being a woman is not necessarily associated with privilege compared to being a man. Being Black is not associated with privilege compared to being a white person. If you are heterosexual, that is a form of privilege compared to someone who is gender diverse. And then also another example being like religion, someone who is a Christian, there is more privilege associated with Christianity than other religions. So even thinking about microaggressions and how they affect people differently has a lot to do with the multiple identities that someone has.
Yeah, following on what everybody say, I am also not from Mankato. I am from Minneapolis. So coming here for school was a huge culture shocking for me as well. Yeah, there's a lot of microaggression like that happens every day to like people of color. But some ones that are popular that I have seen is like when they see that you have an accent, like when they ask you like, where are you from? And you were like, oh, I'm from the city. And they were like, no, like, where are you from? And I'm just like, I'm from the city. Are you asking me my ethnicity or my nationality? Like, I'm confused. And they were like, no, like, you're not from here because of you have accent, or like you just look different. And I'm just like, oh. So it kind of become like actually just normal things like where you see every day, and it becomes a normal thing. So sometimes I like to educate people and be like, hey, I'm actually from here, but I speak multiple language, so that's that. But yeah.
I mean, to be quite honest, is anyone from here? No. So I think people confuse like it. A lot of things come from a place of ignorance. Like what you're really trying to ask me is this. And, you know, when Shadow is talking about teachable moments, sometimes you do want to make things a teachable moment, but sometimes you're tired and you're annoyed and you don't feel like saying, I think what you meant was, where is, you know, what's my ethnicity or what's my, you know, so that can be really exhausting. So I completely get it. It does get tiring.
And Dani, I was just gonna speak to that point because, like, yes, I do give people grace and I do make moments teachable, but at the same time, it's like every day I'm not in that position or I'm not in that place to just come and be like, okay, like here's a teachable moment for you. So it's really more so just switching the conversation around, like, what do you mean? Like, say what you really mean, you know, and then making it to where like, okay, no, like I really am from here, you know? So I do give people grace, but I get it. Like sometimes we're in a position in life, especially African-American women, and I can only speak for myself because I am an African-American woman. I go through so much throughout a day that I get tired of like wanting to teach somebody something. So it's really more so I try not to catch an attitude, but that's not always the case. Like I am snotty and I am rude and I am when I'm tired, when I'm at a place of being just tired of just like you're supposed to know better. And sometimes I feel bad about it because it's like sometimes they don't know better. But in some cases, like you live in the world just like I live in the world. So it's like this doesn't need to be me teaching you. It needs to be you looking at the world and you taking it in from the world. Like this is not something that is okay. Like this is not okay. So I definitely get it.
I think you brought up an interesting point, even in thinking about microaggressions, because the next question has to do with how do you handle or respond to microaggressions? And I wanted to bring up, because you brought up a really interesting point about like, when you experience microaggressions, you're also going through this experience where you don't want to necessarily play into stereotypes about you. So there's a stereotype about Black women that we can catch an attitude real quick, next start rolling, right? There's a stereotype about Asian women that they are passive. And so almost to the point where, well, you can just say what you want because she's not going to say anything back. And so even thinking about that burden of how do I respond because I don't want to play into the stereotype. I know for me, it can be really hard because I feel like sometimes when someone asks me something to upset me, it's like, if I get upset, now you get to say, see, this is what I'm talking about, you know? And so always just like having those thought processes that I feel like other people may not necessarily have to have because you're not overly concerned with stereotypes against you. Maya in the chat said it's frustrating when you try to educate, but then when they take offense and call you sensitive. And that's why these things, they're subtle, but they're not. You know, you're second guessing. There's just a lot of thinking, a lot of emotions going on. It can be quite uncomfortable to say the least. So the next question, I want you all to speak to how you handle microaggressions, but I want us to dig a little bit deeper. So when you are talking about how you handled a specific microaggression, I want you to explain exactly what was said, because the purpose of this is to educate. And I don't want people to leave here thinking they don't know an example of a microaggression. So when you bring up a situation where you felt like, yes, this happened to me and I handled it like this, I want you to give the scenario as to what was actually said or what was done to you, if you don't mind.
I can start. One microaggression I've experienced, especially being an African American woman, is people pointing out the way that I talk. And they'll say things like, oh, you don't talk like you're Black, or you talk very proper. Or they might say something like, you're very articulate. And so I mentioned earlier coming from a place of assumption. And so when I hear things like that, that tells me that you think I'm not supposed to talk a certain way, or you have me in a box already before I speak, and you think that my voice is going to come out differently than it is. And then I guess it's a shock to us both. And so I think that is an experience that I have encountered a lot, especially even from family members, because I go to the suburbs of Chicago with my family and they're like, oh, talk like a white girl. And I'm like, how do white girls talk? And so, and then come back to Southern Illinois where they're like, you don't talk like a Black girl. And I'm like, I guess I just talk medium. And so with that, I think I've had to kind of call people out in a way and just be like, ask people, if people are going to ask you questions that make you uncomfortable, that doesn't have to be a space that you just exist in alone. And so you ask them, well, thank you. I feel like I am very articulate, but how did you expect me to talk? Or what did you expect? And so I think that kind of puts people in a position to question themselves and kind of think critically about what they had said. And so sometimes it doesn't require you to educate them or even to check people. It just puts them in the same position that they had previously put you in as well. And so I think that is a big part of coming from a place of assumption or coming from pointed questions. Is I think people in the Midwest especially, but all over the United States as a whole, are very passive in what they ask, and they sugarcoat things. And from what I've had from experience with friends from other countries, is they say what they mean, and that's something I've come to appreciate. And so I just get real with people like, hey, if you wanted to ask me this, you don't have to be afraid, and I will answer your question, but you don't have to ask me one question when you really mean something else.
I really like that you talked about holding people accountable. You don't have to, you can take that opportunity, and it doesn't have to be, now let me give you an English lesson, or, but you can respond in a way that still you are dignified and to not really go very deep. Like, what did you mean when you said that? That is a perfect thing you can just say to start a conversation. And as a speech language pathologist, I cannot not say this. Being articulate is not associated with being white. So articulation, how you produce your sounds, has nothing to do with your race or your ethnicity. A form of systemic racism that has been going on for a while is to demonize and criminalize African-American people for using African-American English, which is our language, as well as, speaking differently. And so even in our profession, like, we constantly have to check ourselves for, what we say about children of color. Oh, wow, they're so articulate. That's interesting that you said that, because you didn't think they could be articulate. That is a problem. So we really want to be thinking critically about how we feel about people speaking, because that can be like a first layer of symbolic violence against someone. Anyone else like to share an experience and how you handled it?
I am a Black mother, and even my daughter being 7, we experience the same thing. So my daughter is very outspoken, like I am, and people confuse, like, people be like, oh, she's sassy, she's very sassy, and it's like, don't confuse her sass with determination. Don't confuse her sass with her advocating for herself, So we both go through the same thing, because they're like, oh, Shadow, you're sassy. And it's like, no, I am passionate when I speak. Don't confuse my passion with me being aggressive or me being too sassy for you, take me seriously. But like you mentioned before, Dani, like, in the workplace, I am new to my position, and I am an alumni of Mankato State University. So a lot of people know me. So I'm sitting in a meeting, and a lot of people are like congratulating me on my new position. And one lady goes, she's like, oh, I didn't. She was like, congratulations. I didn't expect you. No, she didn't say she didn't expect me. She was like, oh, congratulations on how far you made it. As if she didn't expect me to make it far at all, you know, or as if she didn't expect to see me in a higher up position. Because when she did know me, I was actually working as a janitor here in Mankato. So it's like when she seen me in this position, it was more so like congratulations. I didn't expect to see you in the position that you're in today. I mean, she didn't so far say those words, but it's how I took it. And I'm like, so, you know, like, where did you expect to see me? And she laughed it off as if it was just like, oh, a joke. And I'm just looking like, I'm confused at this point, like, okay, like, I'm serious. Like, where did you expect to see me? And at that moment, it wasn't more so a teachable moment for me because I didn't teach her anything. I literally just looked at her confused, like, because like I said, I wasn't in a headspace right then and there to have that teachable moment for her, but it was more so like, I think she realized what she said after she said it, when she seen my facial expression and my body language. Like, so where did you expect to, like, what did you expect? You know, who did you expect to walk in the room, you know? So, and there's plenty other experiences like that here in Mankato, where I just feel like when a Black woman walks into a room and her presence is known, it's more so like, oh, you know, they confuse her loud speaking, because I do have a volume when I speak, and I can't help that. But I think a lot of people confuse my volume or confuse my passion with aggression, or why am I angry, or why am I sassy, or it doesn't have to be to where I'm giving so much oomph into my speaking, when it's literally like, I'm passionate, and I'm passionate about what I speak, especially if I know my stuff, especially if I know what I'm talking about. So yeah, those are my experiences.
Yeah, I think especially in a place like Mankato, when professors are mostly white, when you see a person of color that is, you know, on staff, on faculty, whatever your position, it is like, you work here? So you work here? Like here? I have experienced that more times than I would like to. But I think, you know, one thing you're speaking of people confusing, you know, your aura and the way that you show up in the world and negatively stereotyping that. And I think it would really be a shame for you to internalize all of these experiences and say, well, I'm not going to show up like X, Y, and Z because I don't want people to think this. And it's so important that when we experience these microaggressions, that we don't, you know, cave and not show up as our authentic selves, because we deserve to show up as our authentic selves in the world. And people have to just start getting used to the way that we take up space. So keep being shadow.
And just to like piggyback off that, like I used to internalize it a lot, to where I used to, because it wasn't just from, you know, people, it wasn't just from, you know, the Caucasian race, it was from people of color too, who used to look at me like, oh, okay, you know, she's loud, she's very like aggressive, she's like she's, and then I used to internalize it. So when I walked into a room, it's more so like I had to give myself a pep talk, and I had to check myself before I go in the room. Like, okay, this is how, you know, this is how to act, you know, this is how you compose yourself, you know, don't get so, when you become passionate, you know, speak softer, you know, keep your composure, don't talk so much with your hands, because as you see, I talk a lot with my hands. So I did internalize it until like a couple of years, when I had a mentor give me a pep talk, like, you are you. Shine your light bright, don't dim yourself for nobody. And when you walk into a room, own it and own your stuff, you know? So I really did. And I think it goes for, I think that's true for a lot of people of color, where we have to give ourselves this mental pep talk before we go into somewhere, because we hear these microaggressions every day, or we hear these stereotypes every day, that we have to sometimes dim our light to walk into a room, or to just give ourselves that talk, like, or we I would know that all of you have heard of code switching, or we code switch when we do a lot of things, only because we don't want people to, you know, microaggress us or to stereotype us when we walk in that room. But I'm here to say, Dani, I own my stuff. Now I do.
That's right. And code switching is exhausting. We're talking about things that exhaust us, right? Code switching is not only exhausting. Teen Vogue, I was surprised at them. I haven't read Teen Vogue in a long time, but I'm like, okay, y'all waking up a little bit. Teen Vogue recently posted an article about like the mental health trauma of code switching. And they were more so speaking of code switching as far as language, like when you're using, you know, the way you talk at home in certain settings, and then you switch at work and other settings. But it's burdensome, and we shouldn't have to do that. We, at some point, we have to make a decision and say, hey, I'm not code switching. I'm not going to succumb to people's stereotypes of me. I'm just going to decide to show up authentically. So thank you for adding that. And I love all this conversation going on in the chat. Keep it going. I will go back and address if there were any questions. But would anyone else want to just share a specific microaggression experience and maybe how you handled it?
I can go. Following up what Shadow just talked about, like coming across as aggressive or like the angry Black woman. Yeah, I had one conversation with someone a couple of months back, and it was like, I am not racist. I have a Black friend, and I like start talking about it, and it's like, you can be Black, you can have a Black friend and still be racist. Like, that's nothing to do with anything. And they were like, this is why I don't like having this conversation with you people. Like, you're always so angry, aggressive. So yeah, that didn't work well. But it's just like, always as a Black woman, I have to like, when I'm having a conversation with people, I'm very passionate as well. I like open communication. So I like to say what's on my mind. And that comes across as a like aggressive or like just like loud or talking a lot or anything like that. So yeah, it's a real thing. And as a Black woman, I have to always check myself, be like, okay, am I being too aggressive or whatever? I do agree with Shadow.
Absolutely. And saying things like, you people, or I have a Black friend, or I don't see color. Those are examples of microaggressions. These are examples of racism. Now, racism is systemic. So there is a system going on, whether you want to be a part of it or not, whether you claim to be a part of it or not, whether you try really hard not to be or not, that is not the issue. The issue is that there is a system that has been going on forever. And so once we begin to acknowledge our place on this spectrum in this system, then we're able to move forward. But it is very detrimental to say things to people of color, like the statements you just mentioned, because they are not helpful, because they do not acknowledge systemic racism. They deny that it exists.
May I add something, Professor Dani? I think microaggression that is like largely under categorized is just like people being nosy. Like, sometimes you can't ask people super personal questions, and I have gotten in the habit of lying to folks whenever they ask me a personal question. So I think I have friends, for example, who their parents are not native to the US, or they're immigrants, or they're still trying to figure out their immigration status. And asking people personal questions such as like, where do they live? Or, for example, making fun of their language barriers, I feel like says a lot about who you're talking to more than it says it says a lot about who is asking the question. And so I think especially in the United States, we have to get used to not knowing everything about people, because sometimes people aren't in a place where they're willing to share, or they feel like their personal or family safety is at risk if they share. And so I think that is a big microaggression that is overlooked, of just being nosy. But we need to practice the art of caring about ourselves and only needing personal information on a need to know basis.
In America, we have a very serious problem of wanting to put people in boxes. It is like, I cannot talk to you, I can't get to know you until I know, what are you? And what are these certain things about you? Someone put in the chat a question kind of related, and I actually want to answer it, or at least I'm not going to answer it probably, but I'm going to just bring up some points because I don't have all the answers. But Jenny put in the chat, I work as an admin assistant and I fill out authorization forms for students when they are hired as a student workers. Depending on if a student is international or not, has worked for the university before, will determine where the student needs to go and what paperwork needs to be completed. Typically, I'm only in contact with the student via email and have to ask those questions. I usually just flat out say, are you an international student and have you worked for the university before? Is this appropriate? Any tips on how else I could approach it if it's not appropriate? I felt like this question could be addressed because it really aligns with what you're saying, Reauna. Like, what is appropriate as far as the questions that we ask? Where is the continuum between do I just want to know, am I being nosy, or do I really need to know this information? I think for me, and you guys can please jump in, especially like in my current role and wanting to get to know my students so that I can build relationships with them, I think I just try to take the approach of asking everyone the same questions instead of looking at someone's last name and then I have a certain list of questions for them. So even if you know that you need to know this information, perhaps there can be like a quick survey that you give everyone. So it's not just specifically, hey, I noticed your last, and I know you would never say this, but kind of this is what's happening. Hey, I noticed your last name looks like this, and I'm wondering if you're an international student. Instead, just having questions for everyone, and not really kind of putting someone in a box, if that makes any sense. I don't know if anyone can speak to that.
Yeah, I did want to address this because this is something that I also deal with a lot. Being asked if I'm an international student, being thought of as a student and not as a staff. And of course, there are teaching moments too, where I can talk to them that, I was a student, I finished my grad program, so you were right. I may look like a student, but it's multiple layers in that, because in my ethnic group, we are Hmong and we're not tied to a country. So if you're asking me and asking where I'm from, I can tell you like our adoptive land, but we're not tied to a country. And so when you think it's a simple question, it's not really, because it's depending on the people's history and where they trace their heritage. And so for this question, I think we as folks from diverse backgrounds, we do the extra work. And so if you're in a capacity where you can do the extra work, like if you can just look up the student, does it list that they are an international student, then go from there. Because I think race in the US is very different from race in any other country. And if an international student is here, they also are coming with an understanding, like I have to go through these extra paperwork because of immigration, things like that. But if you're just asking a diverse person in the US, if they're international, that's where we get to the microaggressions. And so do the extra work. If you can look up the student, find that information for yourself. If you need to ask, like Professor Dani said, have it the same for everyone else. Also, let's see. I just get, because of course I'm feeling very emotional right now because this is something that I deal with a lot. And I think like what our other panelists have brought up, it depends on that time of day, right? Has today been a good day? Can I deal with this right now, or am I going to be emotional about it because this happens so often? And so I hope our attendees can kind of see how we kind of go through this process, and how, even right now, I'm feeling very emotional about it. And I see in our chat, our attendees are also dealing with a lot of these type of thoughts too. But those would be my 2 cents on how to do that and how to approach that and do the extra work instead of having the other folks do the extra work.
I think that was so beautifully said. So putting, don't let me get all preachy, but cultural humility is a term that has to do with an other orientation. And so I think what you're speaking of is really putting another person before yourself. And instead of you putting the burden on the person of color to answer all these questions and to clear your mind and to help you with the assumptions that you have, you should really take it the other way around. And you should say, what can I do instead of putting all of this on them? Because it is incredibly burdensome. And I think for people on the panel and also in the chat, because there are several people in the chat as well and participating who have experienced microaggressions, please first acknowledge that this is a form of symbolic violence because it is violence against you. So although it may be subtle, it has an effect on you, and you have to, you need to assess your mental health on the extent of whether you can engage or not. Some days I have all the time to engage with people when they want to come for me, but some days I don't, and it's okay because it's a lot. And so just constantly thinking about your own mental health, because the burden is just real. So we have just a few more questions, but I actually want to get to this last question before we just open up questions from the audience. I think would be really nice to close with audience questions. So the last question is, and we all are in different positions, we all have different platforms. So how do you use your current platform or role to confront and educate about microaggressions?
Well, in my current role as a staff member here at Minnesota State University, I see a lot of different students. So I'm always in a teachable moment, and I'm in a lot of different meetings. So those are teachable moments for me too, just to speak up and let your voice be heard. I don't always have to speak. It's not what you say, but it's how you say it. So I have learned to say things in a passive way the first time. And then I have learned to have a conversation because I am an open-minded person. I don't pull the race card quick too often, but sometimes it needs to be pulled because sometimes I am there to tell you something, and then some people just don't get how I talk. Some people just don't quite understand it. They're just like, huh? What? Like, why are you always, why? And then here comes the questions and the invalidation of the experiences because, they don't feel like experiences are facts. So then I have to break it down to them a little more aggressively, as they would put it, and get my point across. So I'm always in a teachable moment. It just like the panelists have said, it just depends on the day of whether I want to be passive about it or whether I want to give it to you straight. And that goes for faculty, staff, and student. Well, not student. I'm passive with the student and then if I can't get it across to the student, I'm sending them to someone who can actually, or who their peer or somebody who they can relate with.
I would say one thing I'm grateful for in my role is being able to support those voices. I'm not the rep for all Asian American experiences, and so I have the capacity to work and partner with different organizations, different speakers, and bring them to our campus community so that we can learn from them. So that's one thing that I'm grateful for within my role here.
I would say in my role, I'm technically, even though I don't represent experiences for everyone, I'm supposed to be the voice for everyone or all students at the university. And so something I've had to really focus on is not pulling up the ladder behind me, first of all. And by that, I mean, I'm in my role now because of a Black woman who came before me 2 years ago. And she made sure to extend every opportunity and just ask if I wanted certain opportunities and make sure that she didn't pull up the ladder behind her, and know that success for me is also success for all students as well. And so something I've also done to kind of address microaggressions in this position is not assume that there is any one normal experience. So I've met students who are parents, I've met students who are homeless, I've met students who come from, you know, very upper class, rich families. And so not assuming any one experiences is representative of all students as well, and making sure that whenever I elevate my issues, I'm elevating the issues of other people as well, because I'm not in a position to say if it's an issue or if it's a problem or not, because I'm not the one experiencing it. And so really making sure that you are being inclusive and making sure that you are constantly working to understand other perspectives than your own, because I think if you settle with the fact that you know everything, or that you settle too much in one position, then you are cutting yourself off from learning. And so we are in an environment right now at the university where we're supposed to constantly be learning. And so making sure that I remain open, even if it's to things that I don't necessarily like or that I didn't necessarily know before.
Thank you for that. Did anyone else want to share on the panel before we get to some audience questions? Thank you all so much for being open and sharing. It is not easy kind of recanting these experiences, but I really appreciate you all. So I'm going to go ahead and start addressing some of the questions in the chat. Janelle said, I'm wondering if any of you have white friends or family members that engage in microaggressions, and if you feel comfortable calling them on that. I'm a white woman with some friends of color, and I want to make sure they feel comfortable in calling me out if I'm unknowingly engaging in microaggressions. Thank you, Janelle. That's such a brave question that you asked, and I think it's very relevant. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about it really just depends on the relationship that you have with your friends, and hopefully so maybe something you can think about, maybe do some self-reflection and think about, how do you respond when your friends bring up anything related to their culture, just identity, because sometimes we have in our relationships that we have, there are opportunities that come up, and the way that people respond is how people of color kind of interpret, okay, I can continue with this person, or I'm not going to engage with this person. You know, just as a Black woman with now, I do engage with more white people than I have probably my entire life. I think that there are certain people where they have created a space where I feel comfortable bringing things up. One of the things that they do that makes me feel safe is that they ask a lot of questions. Is it okay if I say this? And so that shows me that they are trying, that they are open. And so then in turn, I feel safe and open with them. But I think it really just depends on the person. So perhaps just some self-reflection on maybe like how you respond in certain situations. And then also have the conversation. The worst that can happen is that you have a conversation saying, hey, I want to make sure I'm not doing this. Can you recall a time maybe when I did? The worst thing that can happen is that they bring something up and you apologize. Or what is the worst that can happen? So I think it also just strengthens your relationships when you are more transparent. A relationship can only go so far if you are only having very surface conversations.
I'd like to echo that. Yeah, with all of my friendships, I have to start off on a basis of like honesty. And so I tell my friends like for example, my deepness of friendship with you is going to depend on how honest I can be with you. And so I make sure that we are constantly having conversations, because it would be nice to be able to exist outside the realms of race in the United States, but that's not possible. And so I think even in your mother's womb, they knew what you were going to be before they knew what gender you were going to be or anything else about you. And so me and my friends always talk about it. Me and my vice president, Kara, she is white. And so she'll ask me like, is this a white thing that I do? And so I'll let her know like the cultural differences, and we'll have conversations that don't have to be heavy. And I think that's something that to also point out is that every conversation about race does not have to be a super heavy, symbolic, or traumatizing one. And me and her have jokes and make fun of each other all the time for different things. And so I think starting off your friendship on a basis of like, hey, what are we going to be able to talk to each other about? And then establishing it from there.
I love that you said that. It does not have to be, come, let's sit down. I have something I want to say to you, my Black friend or my Asian friend. It does not have to be like that. Like you want to be able to be comfortable in your friendship. So I love that you said that. It does not have to be heavy with violence playing in the background. The next question, Peyton said, I'm a white person from a rural city in South Dakota and often find myself around people who have a lot of microaggressions. So I find myself in positions to try and call them out or just educate them on what they said is not okay. What is the best way to educate people while I have not experienced what other people of color have? I want to be able to help, but I don't want to step on toes if I do it wrong. I'll address this and then someone else please do. One of the things is that first acknowledging that we all have blind sites, all of us. So even me as a person of color, as a Black person, I am going to have blind spots for an Asian person's experience or a gender diverse person's experience. So first acknowledging, like doing the self-reflective work in yourself, saying, I too have blind spots. Then when you want to address other people, I think it has to be not from a place of, I don't do this because, it doesn't need to be from a place of like, I'm higher than you. But I think the education just comes from a simple conversation and maybe speaking of giving very explicit examples of why you feel like what someone said is offensive. I don't know. Can anyone else answer this? I don't think you should be concerned about doing it wrong because that's like, white supremacy culture tells us to be perfectionists and we shouldn't bring up anything if we don't know and we're not 100% sure that we're going to say it right. So you're not going to say it right, more than likely. There's no one right way. Can anyone else hop on this one?
I don't think, you said you don't want to step on anybody's toes. I actually think that white people or Asian people or Black people, they digest stuff and they hear it more when it comes from the same ethnic group of them. So you can't, the thing that I would say is that if someone is saying something inappropriate or someone is saying a microaggression to a person of color, let that person of color address it or let that person of color step in. And if they don't, that will be your time to step in and tell them why, why that person was wrong. But I don't believe you can step on anybody's toes if you are the one hearing the microaggression and you are trying to educate someone of your peer or someone of your ethnic background, because I believe it's perceived a lot quicker and a lot more genuinely when it comes from somebody of the same race as you.
Such a good response. Anyone else?
There are one more questions. I don't know if you guys can see from my curve. I don't know. I might be saying her name wrong. Are you guys allowed to see it? Or?
Okay. Mm-hmm. Can you see it, Dani?
No.
She said, how do you confront or deal with the microaggression that is nonverbal? Is it noticeable that no one wants to sit next to you? For example, noticeable when no one wants to sit next to you. So,
this is in the chat.
Well, yeah, it's in the Q&A. She asked me.
Oh, my bad. I forgot this is a webinar. I'm sorry. I'm a little new to this. Thank you. That's such a great question because, microaggressions, they don't have to be verbal slights. Like someone spoke of, I think Pakou, maybe you talked about it, about like people looking at you and like, you can feel it. Maybe you can't put words to it. Would anyone like to answer this?
I can.
Okay.
I think like those type of microaggression can actually affect your mental health because you have to like ask yourself like, what's wrong with me? Why like no one want to sit next to me? So one way I deal with those type of microaggressions is like I have to tell myself the problem is not me. I'm not the issue. You're the issue because I haven't done anything to you. We don't know each other. And then the fact that like you can't even sit next to me, that is your problem. And that's how I take it. And I think that's how you just maybe sit next to people that you know or you feel like comfortable with. For example, if it's a classroom, sit in the front row, because most of the time this front row is open. You can like talk to the professors, and don't think about those that like individual who don't even want to sit next to you. So I would just say, just don't think about it to do business. You're not the problem. That's how I deal with those type of things.
Absolutely. Microaggressions are more of a reflection on the person who is doing that than the person that the violence is actually against. So we have to, at some point, like, not internalize, even though it is very hard, not internalize other people's response to us as truth, and not to take it personally, because a lot of times it comes from ignorance, whether that is deliberate or unintentional.
I would say find your people, and by that I mean find your group of people that relate to you and that can respond to you the best. Unfortunately, there are going to be some instances where it's literally nothing you've done, but people are just so stuck in their ways or stuck in ignorance to where they're not going to accept you no matter what type of person you are. And so I have had to settle in the fact that not everybody is my person, not everybody is going to be part of my gang. And so I've had to stay away from those people who aren't, and then become closer and connect more with the people who are.
And just to piggyback off, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just saying, I love that. Yes, go ahead.
Just to piggyback off of Reauna, like you will drive yourself crazy in thinking about what you think a person thinks of you, or the facial expression, you know, that they're making. That's going to drive you crazy, because sometimes you don't know. Sometimes things are not intentional, and sometimes people don't mean, you know, what you think they mean. So, and that just goes for nonverbals. You know, sometimes nonverbals is miscommunicated, I should say. So I definitely agree with Reauna. Find your people, find who fits with you, and go from there. Like, don't drive yourself crazy thinking about why somebody looked at you a certain way, or why somebody didn't want to sit next to you, because like Professor Dani said, they have their own issues, and they're dealing with something internally, and that's not on you to try and figure it out or to try and fix. That's on that person.
Absolutely. I think what you guys are bringing up are some great closing points, just wanting to be cognizant of everyone's time. I think for people who have experienced microaggressions, some things that you need to do is, number one, always show up as your authentic self. Feel free to take up space, assess your mental health so you can decide if you want to engage or disengage, and have a tribe of people where these things happen. You can debrief and you can build yourself back up again, because it is hard. And for people who maybe you are not a person of color, or maybe you are from, you have a little more privilege than others, perhaps just wanting to go on from this panel and have a conversation with someone close to you, and really not only just self-reflecting, but maybe thinking critically about maybe some things that you have said or actions that you have had, so that hopefully you will not participate in symbolic violence anymore, such as microaggressions. And you're not being rude. That's right, Alex, you are not being rude. You have to make that decision. It is not rude when you don't want to engage. You are taking care of yourself, as we all should. So Liz, would you like to say anything? I'm gonna be quiet now.
This is just time for the remote applause. Thank you all so much to our panelists for sharing these difficult experiences that you've had, with the hope that our community is listening and empowering others to do better, and empowering ourselves to do better. So thank you all so much. And thanks for that advocacy for your peers and classmates and colleagues who are experiencing microaggressions as well. I am so grateful. We will be having a second conversation on microaggressions next month as part of the Diversity Institute. And I do want to remind folks, when you attend and we keep attendance through Zoom logs, you receive a LinkedIn badge and a very fancy zippy sweatshirt. To our panelists, you get a zippy sweatshirt also. But thank you all so much, and please do stay in touch with the Maverick Diversity Institute.